Complete a full hypothesis test for the mean with population standard deviation unknown. Here with the p-value approach. First, let's read our question. A marketing agency would like to test the claim the number of social media platforms a company relies on for advertising is less than 2 platforms. So that 2 is what we're testing. The agency decides to complete a hypothesis test at a 5% significance level. They sample 28 companies and determine the sample number of social media platforms to be 1.95 on average with a sample standard deviation of S equals 0.6. Work through the testing procedure and interpret the results of the hypothesis test. Remember those steps. The first is to identify the null and the alternative hypothesis. Next, we will decide on the significance level. We'll compute the test statistic. We will find the p-value, and then we will use that information to interpret the results of this hypothesis test. Let's jump in. First, the null and alternative hypothesis. Remember that the claim is less than 2 platforms. That's going to be important. Also recall that the null hypothesis is always the equality. So we know that H sub 0, our null hypothesis, is mu equals 2 because 2 is what we're claiming. Because we're talking about less than 2 platforms, our alternative hypothesis is mu is less than 2. To decide on our significance level, it tells us that we're working at a 5% significance level, so that means alpha is 0.05. Recall with a p-value approach, we are going to compare our p-value to our significance level here of alpha. Now we compute the test statistic. You need all of the relevant information. I highly recommend you write all of this down. So we know we are testing 2 platforms, but we also know we sampled 28 companies. The sample number of social media platforms is 1.95, and the sample standard deviation is S equals 0.6. So our X bar, 1.95, the sample mean. Our mean of 2 is what we are testing, sorry, our given mean. Sample standard deviation is 0.6, and our N, or our sample size, is 28. Because our population standard deviation is unknown, we are going to be using a t-score. So t sub 0 is our X bar minus mu sub 0 divided by S divided by the square root of N. This is why I recommend you write all of the information down, those key values you're going to need. It makes it easier to substitute them into the formula as you're getting ready to work. Also, please make sure if you're plugging this all into your calculator at one time, you're using parentheses appropriately. Always follow the order of operations when dealing with fractions within fractions. After completing this test statistic, we find that value to be a negative 0.44. Because we are using t-values, we must use the t-distribution table to find the p-value. So we're going to use the table of areas in the right tail for the t-distribution in the row for 27 degrees of freedom. So remember that degrees of freedom are n minus 1. So since our sample size is 28, our degrees of freedom will be 28 minus 1, which is 27. So we're going to go down the left-hand column in our t-distribution table and find 27 degrees of freedom. Now, when you look at the values available, our test statistic is 0.44. That is nowhere on this table, but the smallest number is 1.314. So we know that our test statistic will be to the left of that because it's less than. So looking at the table, that means if you look up the area in one tail, tells us that if our test statistic was 1.314, our p-value would be 0.10. But because our test statistic is actually less than 1.314, our p-value is going to be greater than that 0.10. We don't really have an exact value for the p-value because the table is not that extensive, but we already have enough information by just knowing the p-value is greater than 0.10. So when I go to interpret the results, remember that if your p-value is greater than your alpha, or your level of significance, then we would fail to reject. Also known as if the p-value is less than your level of significance, you would reject the null hypothesis. In our case, our p-value is greater than 0.10. In alpha, our level of significance is 0.05. So since the p-value is greater than alpha, we should fail to reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, at the 5% significance level, the data do not provide strong evidence for the marketing agency to conclude that the number of social media platforms a company relies on for advertising is less than 2. Our data do not provide strong enough information. So that's the key. If we fail to reject, there is not enough information. That's the key.